different literary movements, or excuse me, different literature from the 1950s. And the last thing we mentioned were the Kinsey reports. And people had a tough time accepting some of those conclusions. And granted, there are problems with Kinsey's methodology, and today people still study sexuality, and they think that he might have gotten a few things wrong, but at the same time, they don't completely throw out his theory. Indiana University, for example, still has a school within it that studies human sexuality that's named after Kinsey. Also, you get a book of poetry by Allen Ginsberg called Howl. It's extremely sexually explicit. It uses lots of terminology that adults definitely would not be okay with. And Ginsberg is part of that beat writer movement with Jack Kerouac, and they definitely are the enemies of adults and established culture. Truman Capote, you might be familiar with him. Late 1950s, he writes a book which you maybe would call the first true crime book of the 20th century, at least the first major one that kind of captivates people's attention. In Cold Blood, talks about some murders that happened out in the Midwest in Kansas, and Capote details the people who committed these crimes, why they did it, and how the system as a whole needed to be addressed, because the situation was not quite as simple as what people thought. If you get a chance, you should read any of these books. I'm not saying that they're ideal, but they reveal a lot about history, if not about humanity. One other book we want to mention, it's not written until or published until the 1960s, but Betty Friedan writes a book about women from the 1950s called The Feminine Mystique. And The Feminine Mystique, Betty Friedan is questioning women's roles in society. Betty Friedan looks at women, and part of her concept is that women in America are housewives, they're mothers, but eventually their husbands retire and want to do their own thing, children grow up, and what are women left with? It's really exploring the identity of what women are and what they ought to be. And Friedan is kind of asking, is this all there is for women? And maybe there should be more for women. Maybe women have a greater role to play in society. So books at the time period, and literature always tells you a lot about what's going on in that time period. And many of these books that we've mentioned, they question the status quo. They question mainstream. And when you go against the mainstream, people don't necessarily like that. Many of these books have ended up on banned books lists because of their content. Usually it's the sexual content or the questioning of authority that makes people desperately afraid. Another major trend in the 1950s is a resurgence in religion. Christianity has always been popular in the United States, but you're going to see an active number of people attending church in the 1950s. Why? Well, most of them have faced some type of mortal danger in World War II or in ultimately in the Korean War and the Cold War, different conflicts. And you see this time period where people who attended religious services weekly, and there's always a little bit of a breakdown now by age group. You know why older people are going there. They're starting to be more concerned with mortality. But take a look at the numbers of people, even young people, in 1950 and the next decade. In fact, the next decade and a half, church attendance is going to go up. So people are questioning. They're questioning the creation of the universe. What does it all mean? Is this the end of time as we know it? What happens to you when you die? These are things that human beings want to know, and religion states that they have some of the answers. Now, not only does a rise in church attendance increase because of people's mortal threats, but you also see some other individuals who help popularize it. Billy Graham, if you're not familiar, Billy Graham was a traveling evangelist who set up tent revivals in one city to the next and would preach there for several days, urging people to become Christians and follow Jesus Christ. And Graham is an interesting guy. He believed that one of the things that Christianity needed to do was reach out to men and get more men to be part of Christianity. And he figured that if men would follow along, they would bring their families as well, that men are the unquestioned leaders of the household, and women were already more prone to going to church anyway. So Billy Graham often, one of the things he would do is create language that would be something that men can resonate with. So, for example, maybe he would talk about Jesus as the quarterback of your life, or use the phraseology spiritual warfare, things that are traditionally masculine. He would emphasize these types of things. Billy Graham also, it's hard to tell from this picture that I've gotten here, but he always made sure to be physically fit. He believed that it was important to look strong, be strong. He tanned regularly. You can see that his hair is taken care of here. He's a guy that men can look at and say he's not weak. He's a strong man who says that he follows Jesus. So Billy Graham becomes an important person in spreading Christianity. At the time, you also had popular writers like C.S. Lewis, he's British, but his impact is felt in the United States. Some of his fiction works and his nonfiction are really either metaphors for Christianity or outright explicitly arguing for the case for Christianity. You also see religion in movies. Here you see Charlton Heston playing Moses in The Ten Commandments, which is a movie epic not only for its time, but even today, every Easter Sunday, there is a showing of the Ten Commandments. There's also a great film called Ben-Hur about a Roman slave turned Christian and wrestling with taking revenge on the people who wronged him. So, church attendance and religion are important. Now, people also saw religion as important because they saw it as a way to fight back against the bad influences in society, such as the music and the literature at the time. Right? You also see the beginnings of what we call the civil rights movement. Civil rights movement really begins in earnest in the 1950s. Black citizens are dealing with quite a bit. We know about Jim Crow laws, but there's several other things that they're dealing with too. And one of the individuals who becomes immensely popular is Martin Luther King. Martin Luther King Jr. Is a Baptist preacher who is from Alabama, and King takes the approach that Gandhi and Henry David Thoreau had taken before him. It is a nonviolent approach, civil disobedience. King encouraged black individuals to disobey unjust or unfair laws, but to do so in a nonviolent capacity. Part of his mentality was, let's have them arrest us and fill up every single jail so that they can't get anything else done, that eventually they are going to change. But Martin Luther King wasn't the only game in town. Malcolm X, another individual who took a more radical approach. Malcolm X, who grew up in a Christian home, was somebody who experienced racism. His father died under mysterious circumstances, and most people attributed it to the work of the Ku Klux Klan. Malcolm X becomes a resident of New York City. He moves to big cities, and he's a small-time criminal, and when he goes to prison for some of these crimes, he converts to Islam, and he becomes a part of a radical group called the Nation of Islam. He drops his original last name, which was Little, and he says X represents the unknown African name that his family had when they were brought over here as slaves. And he believes in a more violent approach. He doesn't want integration. He doesn't want racial integration. He believes that black and white people can live separately and live fine. He just wants to be treated equally. He referred to white people as blue-eyed devils, and he suggested, or he definitely looks at Martin Luther King as pursuing a different goal in a different way that is kind of naive, right? And we'll talk about the problems that black people are dealing with beyond the obvious Jim Crow laws. But one of the more important things is there's a serious discrepancy between black and white wealth. And white people have access to more money, more wealth than black people do. And you see in this graph that problem's only gotten worse over time. Next video, we'll talk about why that is and what potentially can be done to stop that.